March 28th, 1945. 14:45 hours. Basement shelter. Frankfurt, am Main. Frau Margareta Weber clutched her two sons, Hans, age 11, and little Otto, age 6, as the building above them shook from artillery fire. For 8 days, they had survived on moldy potatoes and water from a broken pipe. The boys' faces were gray with hunger, their lips cracked and bleeding. Otto had stopped crying 2 days ago, too weak even for tears. The Nazi broadcasts had been unambiguous. The Americans were coming to exterminate the German people. Mongrel soldiers led by Jews would torture civilians, burn cities, and exact revenge for every German victory. Death would be a mercy compared to what awaited those who fell into enemy hands. But now the shelling had stopped. Heavy boots descended the basement stairs. Margaret pushed her sons behind her, expecting bullets or bayonets. Instead, a young American voice called down in accented German, "Nicht schießen, wir haben Essen." Don't shoot, we have food. For German civilians who had been conditioned to view American soldiers as vengeful exterminators, the greatest shock of defeat came not from occupation or surrender, but from the moment enemy hands offered them chocolate bars, canned meat, and cigarettes, transforming their understanding of both war and humanity with the simple act of sharing abundance in the ruins of the Third Reich. Germany in early 1945 had become a nation consuming itself. 7 years of total war had stripped the country of everything except rubble and desperation. The elaborate rationing system that had sustained civilians through the early war years had collapsed completely as Allied bombing destroyed distribution networks and the Eastern Front devoured the last agricultural resources. By March 1945, official rations in German cities had fallen to 1,200 calories per day for normal consumers, barely half what the human body needs to survive. In reality, most civilians received far less. Supply chains had disintegrated. Distribution centers had been bombed into oblivion, and the Nazi authorities had redirected all remaining food to military units fighting their hopeless last stand. Children developed the bloated bellies and stick-thin limbs of advanced malnutrition. Adults aged decades and months, their bodies consuming muscle tissue to stay alive. The elderly simply died quietly in freezing apartments, too weak to seek help that no longer existed. The psychological devastation matched the physical suffering. Families that had once embodied German respectability fought over garbage. Women traded family heirlooms for half-rotten vegetables. Children learned to steal food from corpses in the streets. The vaunted German order and discipline had dissolved into a Hobbesian nightmare where survival trumped all social bonds. Nazi propaganda had spent 12 years building a worldview where Germans were engaged in a cosmic struggle for racial survival. As defeat became inevitable, Goebbels's propaganda machine shifted from promising victory to promising martyrdom. The message was clear. American occupation meant extermination. Radio broadcasts described American soldiers as racially mixed savages incapable of mercy or civilization. The mongrel American army, commanded by Jews seeking revenge, would torture German men, rape German women, and murder German children. Official directives encouraged civilians to fight to the death, rather than surrender to forces that would show no mercy. The Morgenthau Plan, genuine Allied discussions about reducing Germany to an agricultural state, was seized upon as evidence that Americans intended to starve the entire German population. Propaganda posters showed American soldiers as grotesque caricatures standing over starving German children. The message was unmistakable. Surrender meant death, perhaps slower, but just as certain as battlefield casualties. Village officials received instructions to destroy all food stocks, rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Civilians were ordered to evacuate before American forces arrived, abandoning their homes to face starvation as refugees rather than risk capture. Those who remained were branded as traitors deserving whatever fate the Americans inflicted. The systematic indoctrination created a terror that transcended rational fear of occupation. Civilians genuinely believed they faced racial extermination, not military occupation. The idea that Americans might show kindness was literally unthinkable within the Nazi worldview that had shaped German consciousness for over a decade. American military logistics in Europe operated on principles that German civilians, accustomed to years of rationing and scarcity, could barely comprehend. The rations carried by individual American soldiers exceeded the caloric intake of most German civilians by a factor of 3 or 4. Each American soldier carried K rations or C rations, providing approximately 3,600 calories per day through combinations of canned meat, cheese, crackers, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes, and candy. These rations were designed not merely for survival, but for maintaining morale and fighting effectiveness through abundant nutrition that kept troops psychologically satisfied even under combat conditions. Beyond individual rations, American supply lines delivered fresh food, additional canned goods, and luxury items to forward positions with a regularity that seemed miraculous to observers familiar with German supply difficulties. The Red Ball Express and other logistics operations treated food abundance as a fundamental requirement rather than a luxury, creating surpluses that could be shared even while maintaining active combat operations. The contrast with German military rations was devastating. By 1945, German soldiers often subsisted on black bread, thin soup, and whatever they could scavenge, the vaunted Wehrmacht, which had marched into Russia expecting quick victory, now barely had enough food to keep its troops fighting. The idea that an enemy army could have food to spare for civilians seemed to violate every assumption about total war. Private Eddie Morrison from Tennessee had fought his way across France and into Germany, expecting to face fanatical resistance in every town and village. His unit had been warned about Nazi werewolf units preparing guerrilla warfare. They'd been told that German civilians might be as dangerous as soldiers. What they found instead in Frankfurt's ruins were starving families too weak to pose any threat. We came down into this basement and found maybe 30 people crammed in there, Morrison wrote to his mother. Old folks, women, kids, all of them looking like skeletons. The smell was terrible, no sanitation for days. They just stared at us with these huge eyes like they couldn't believe we were real. Morrison and his squad mates began distributing their rations without waiting for orders. Chocolate bars, cans of Spam, crackers, anything they had in their packs. The German civilians' response stunned them. They were scared of the food at first, Morrison recalled decades later, like they thought it was poisoned or a trick. The kids especially, they'd hold the chocolate but wouldn't eat it until their mothers tried it first. When they finally tasted it, you could see their whole understanding of the world just shatter. Young Hans Weber took his first bite of American chocolate with trembling hands, certain it would be his last taste of anything. When the sweetness hit his tongue, so intense after months of flavorless starvation rations, he looked up at the American soldier with confusion that bordered on terror. This wasn't how demons were supposed to behave. Canned meat became a revelation that challenged everything German civilians understood about American intentions and capabilities. The ubiquitous Spam, along with canned ham, beef stew, and chicken, represented protein sources that most Germans hadn't seen since before the war. Sergeant Mike Romano organized food distribution in the town of Darmstadt after his unit secured the area in late March. They discovered over 500 civilians hiding in basement shelters and bombed out buildings, many of them on the verge of starvation. The distribution process required careful management to prevent riots among desperate people who had been living like animals for weeks. Romano established orderly lines where civilians received rations according to family size and medical need. The systematic organization impressed Germans who had experienced only chaos from their own authorities in the final months of the Reich. Herr Friedrich Schultz had served as a postal official before the war and understood bureaucratic organization. His observation of American food distribution revealed capabilities that exceeded anything he had witnessed from Nazi administration, even in the regime's glory days. They had more food in one supply truck than our entire neighborhood had seen in 6 months, Schultz testified after the war. But what amazed me more than the quantity was how they organized it. Everyone got equal shares. Children received extra rations, and sick people got special foods. There was no corruption, no favoritism. They treated us better than our own government ever had. American coffee provided German civilians with their first taste of a beverage that most had replaced with ersatz substitutes years earlier. Real coffee made from actual coffee beans, rather than roasted grain or acorns, created sensory experiences that reminded Germans of peacetime normalcy they had almost forgotten. The coffee distribution often occurred during evening gatherings when American soldiers shared their rations around cooking fires established in destroyed town squares. German civilians observed American customs of casual conversation over hot drinks, social behaviors that contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy and fear that had characterized their interactions with Nazi officials. Frau Helga Schneider, a shopkeeper's wife from Mainz, described her first real coffee in 4 years. The American soldier heated water over a small stove and poured it over brown powder that actually smelled like coffee. When I took the first sip, I started crying. I couldn't help it. It tasted like the world before the war, before everything went mad. The social ritual of sharing coffee created opportunities for limited communication despite language barriers. American soldiers attempted basic German phrases while civilians dusted off their school English. These linguistic exchanges helped establish personal connections that made continued cooperation possible and began breaking down the dehumanizing stereotypes both sides had been taught. American cigarettes became an unexpected currency that provided German civilians with tradable resources in an economy where money had become essentially worthless. The abundant tobacco products that American soldiers carried represented wealth in a society where any commodity with real value was precious. Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields flowed from American supply lines in quantities that seemed inexhaustible to Germans, accustomed to rationing everything from matches to soap. Soldiers who didn't smoke still received cigarette rations, creating surpluses they could share with grateful civilians. The cigarettes served multiple purposes beyond simple smoking. They became currency for black market transactions, gifts that established social bonds, and symbols of American abundance that challenged Nazi propaganda about enemy weakness and resource depletion. 17-year-old Klaus Becker received his first American cigarette from Corporal Danny Walsh, who shared his rations with civilians clearing rubble from a Frankfurt street. The smooth American tobacco was revelation compared to the harsh substitutes Germans had endured during the war. I had been in the Hitler Youth, Becker recalled decades later. They had taught us that Americans were weak, that their mixed-race society made them inferior to pure Germans. But here was this American soldier sharing his cigarettes like it was nothing, while we Germans were literally starving. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The physical and psychological transformation of German children who received American rations provided visible evidence of the impact that adequate nutrition and unexpected kindness had on human development. Children who had been listless and hollow-eyed began showing energy and curiosity as their nutritional status improved. The change was particularly dramatic among young children whose growth had been stunted by prolonged malnutrition. American baby formula, canned milk, and specialized foods allowed rapid recovery that amazed both parents and medical personnel monitoring their progress. Little Otto Weber, who had been too weak to cry in the Frankfurt basement, began playing with other children within 2 weeks of receiving regular American rations. His laughter, once his mother thought she would never hear it again, echoed through the rubble of their destroyed neighborhood. Army Medic Corporal James Sullivan documented the recovery of dozens of malnourished German children in his sector. Within 3 weeks of adequate feeding, you could see the transformation. Their hair regained its shine, their skin improved, and most importantly, they started acting like normal kids again, playing, laughing, getting into trouble. Food was literally bringing them back to life. The psychological changes accompanied physical recovery as children who had lived in constant fear of American demons began trusting the soldiers who consistently provided food, medical care, and even entertainment. American GIs taught German kids how to play baseball, shared comic books, and handed out chewing gum with a generosity that seemed to flow from an inexhaustible source. Chewing gum presented German children with a completely foreign concept that required explanation and demonstration. The idea of food that wasn't meant to be swallowed, that existed purely for pleasure rather than nutrition, challenged their understanding of eating in ways that revealed how deeply total war had distorted normal life. The first encounters with chewing gum often involved confusion and comedy that created moments of genuine laughter in circumstances where joy had seemed impossible. Children would chew briefly, then attempt to swallow the gum, leading to gentle corrections from American soldiers who demonstrated the proper technique. 9-year-old Greta Hoffman received her first piece of chewing gum from Private Bobby Martinez, who showed her how to work her jaw without swallowing. The sustained flavor and the mechanical action of chewing provided sensory stimulation that helped calm her anxiety while demonstrating American generosity in sharing items that had no survival value but provided simple pleasure. The soldiers showed me how to blow bubbles, Hoffman recalled in a 1990s interview. I thought it was magic, making pink spheres appear from my mouth. The other children gathered around to watch, and soon we were all trying to blow bubbles. For those few minutes, we forgot about the war, forgot about the ruins, and just played like normal children. That American soldier gave us back our childhood with a piece of chewing gum. American medical personnel carried specialized foods designed for treating malnutrition and supporting recovery from illness. These medical rations provided nutrients specifically needed by civilians who had suffered from prolonged starvation and vitamin deficiencies. Army medic Lieutenant Sarah Chin treated German civilians in a field hospital established in a former school building in Wiesbaden. Her medical supplies included concentrated vitamins, protein supplements, and easily digestible foods designed for treating severe malnutrition without causing digestive complications. You couldn't just give them regular food, Chen explained in post-war interviews. Their stomachs had shrunk. Their digestive systems weren't functioning properly. We had special formulas, milk powder, vitamin tablets, foods that would build them up gradually without making them sick. The process required patience and medical knowledge. The medical feeding programs demonstrated American commitment to civilian welfare that exceeded basic humanitarian obligations and contradicted everything Germans had been told about enemy intentions. The careful attention to individual medical needs impressed German doctors and nurses who had been operating under impossible conditions with virtually no resources. Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, who had maintained a small practice in Frankfurt throughout the war, observed American medical operations with professional respect. They treated our civilians better than we had been able to treat our own soldiers in the final months. The resources, the organization, the genuine concern for individual welfare, it was everything we had been told Americans lacked. American supply operations in occupied Germany demonstrated logistical capabilities that amazed German observers familiar with the chronic shortages that had characterized their wartime experience. Military supply dumps contained quantities of food that exceeded anything most Germans had seen even during peacetime abundance. The visible abundance in American supply areas challenged Nazi propaganda claims about enemy resource limitations and industrial weakness. German civilians could observe warehouses filled with canned goods, fresh produce, bread baked in mobile field kitchens, and luxury items that seemed to flow endlessly from American supply lines. Quartermaster Sergeant Robert O'Connor managed food distribution for military government operations, feeding over 30,000 German civilians daily by April 1945. His facility contained foods that many Germans had never seen: canned fruit from California, processed cheese from Wisconsin, white bread from field bakeries, meat products that represented industrial food processing unknown in traditional German cuisine. We had so much food, the challenge was distribution rather than supply, O'Connor recalled. Fresh apples, canned peaches, all kinds of stuff that Germans hadn't seen in years. The local people would stand at the fence and just stare at our warehouses. I remember this old woman crying because she couldn't believe that much food existed anywhere in the world anymore. Food sharing created opportunities for cultural exchange that helped both Americans and German civilians understand each other as individuals rather than enemy stereotypes. These interactions often began with simple gestures around shared meals and expanded into broader communications about families, homes, and hopes for the future. Private David Zimmerman, a German Jewish refugee who had fled to America in 1938 and now returned as a U.S. soldier, served as interpreter for civilian relations in the Mannheim area. His ability to speak both languages fluently allowed deeper communications that revealed the human costs of war on both sides. When they found out I was Jewish and had escaped Germany, the reactions varied, Zimmerman recalled. Some were ashamed, some were defensive, but most were just confused. They had been told all Jews were dead, or that we had all been enemies of Germany. Learning that I had grown up in Berlin, that my family had been German for generations before we had to flee, it challenged their understanding of everything the Nazis had taught them. The cultural exchanges often involved sharing information about peacetime life, family traditions, and personal hopes that transcended political boundaries. American soldiers learned about German customs and culture beyond Nazi stereotypes, while German civilians discovered American family values and social practices that contradicted propaganda caricatures. As immediate starvation ended and basic nutrition was restored, American authorities began introducing foods that would support long-term reconstruction of German society. These programs included agricultural supplies, cooking equipment, and foods that could form the basis for renewed local food production. The transition from emergency feeding to sustainable nutrition required teaching new food preparation techniques, introducing unfamiliar ingredients, and helping communities rebuild their capacity for independent food production while avoiding complete dependency on American largesse. Home economics specialist Lieutenant Margaret Walsh taught German women to prepare American-style foods using available ingredients while incorporating traditional cooking methods. These classes became social centers where women shared experiences, learned new skills, and rebuilt community connections shattered by years of Nazi control and wartime destruction. We weren't trying to make them American, Walsh explained. We were trying to give them tools to rebuild their lives. Some American foods worked well with their cooking styles: canned meat in traditional recipes, flour for different kinds of bread. It was about survival, adaptation, and helping them regain their dignity. German children who experienced American food sharing during the occupation carried those memories throughout their lives, often becoming advocates for democratic values and Atlantic partnership. The sensory memories of chocolate, chewing gum, and abundant meals created positive associations that influenced their understanding of America and democracy. Many of these children went on to careers that involved continued contact with Americans, working as teachers, business people, or government officials in the post-war relationship that developed between former enemies. Their childhood experiences of American generosity provided personal foundations for political and economic cooperation that would define the Federal Republic. Hans Weber, who had received that first chocolate bar in the Frankfurt basement, became a teacher who spent his career educating German students about the importance of German-American friendship. He kept a faded photograph of an American soldier handing out rations to children, using it to illustrate how enemies could become friends. That American soldier didn't have to share his chocolate with us, Weber told his students year after year. According to everything we had been taught, he should have shot us instead. He saved our lives and showed us that the world could be different than the Nazis had told us. That lesson shaped everything I became. The abundance that American forces could afford to share with civilian populations provided object lessons in economic systems that challenged German understanding of resource management and industrial capacity. The casual distribution of valuable foods demonstrated wealth that exceeded anything most Germans had experienced, even before the war. German economists and government officials who observed American supply operations began understanding the industrial capacity that had enabled Allied victory, the ability to feed hundreds of thousands of enemy civilians while maintaining military operations revealed economic power that Nazi planners had catastrophically underestimated. These observations influenced post-war West German economic policies that emphasized free markets, international trade, and consumer abundance, rather than autarky and military spending. The demonstration of American prosperity became a model for rebuilding German society along democratic and capitalist lines, eventually contributing to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed West Germany. Former Wehrmacht logistics officer Major Ernst Klein observed American operations as a prisoner of war working with civilian affairs. We had been told that America was weak, that their economy was controlled by Jewish bankers who exploited workers. What I saw was an industrial machine that could produce abundance we couldn't imagine. That realization was more decisive than any battlefield defeat. Food sharing between American soldiers and German civilians created personal relationships that provided emotional foundations for the post-war alliance between former enemies. The memories of kindness shown during vulnerable moments created trust that supported larger political arrangements. Many Germans who received American rations during the occupation became advocates for continued friendship with America throughout the Cold War period. Their personal experiences of American generosity provided credible testimony about American character that supported political leaders who promoted Western alliance against Soviet expansion. The diplomatic impact extended beyond individual relationships to broader cultural understanding that made peaceful coexistence possible between nations that had fought with deadly hatred just months earlier. Food became a bridge between cultures that had seemed irreconcilably opposed, proving that shared humanity could overcome even the most intensive indoctrination. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, hundreds of thousands of German civilians were receiving daily food rations from American sources. The transformation from starvation to adequate nutrition had been accompanied by psychological changes that altered fundamental attitudes toward democracy and the West. The children who had learned to blow bubbles with American chewing gum grew up to become leaders in West Germany's economic miracle and democratic transformation. The elderly who had received their first real coffee in years from enemy soldiers became advocates for peaceful international relations. The mothers who had watched their children's health restored by American generosity became bridges between cultures that built lasting friendship from the ashes of total war. The shock of receiving food from supposed demons had revealed that enemies could become protectors, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, and that democracy could choose mercy over vengeance even in the moment of total victory. For German civilians who had been amazed when American soldiers shared their rations, that amazement became the foundation for a transformed understanding of what was possible when nations chose cooperation over conflict, abundance over scarcity, and humanity over hatred. In the end, the taste of chocolate, the warmth of coffee, and the simple pleasure of chewing gum accomplished what military conquest alone could never achieve: the transformation of fear into trust, hatred into friendship, and enemies into allies who would stand together through decades of Cold War and beyond, building peace and prosperity on the memory of kindness shared in humanity's darkest hour. The Third Reich had promised Germans a thousand-year empire built on racial superiority and military conquest. What they received instead was something far more valuable, a lesson in the power of generosity, the strength of democracy, and the possibility of redemption through the simple act of sharing food with hungry strangers who had once been taught to hate them.